If you've been watching this channel, it's pretty obvious my favorite games come from Nintendo. And with over 30 years in the game console business, I want to go down my list of top 10 Nintendo consoles. I'm including portables, but not multiple iterations of the same system. That means the Game Boy Color, DSi, and 2DS don't get their own entries. I'm also excluding the Switch because it hasn't been out long enough to say where it would be on the list, and the Virtual Boy because it was so bad it doesn't even make the list. With that said, I'm sure you can guess what number 10 is. For my full thoughts on the Wii U, click that video up in the corner. Coming off the massive success of the Wii, Nintendo tried to continue riding that wave, but it was way too late. By 2012, the casuals who bought the Wii either quit playing or only played Wii Sports anyway, and the hardcore gamers had already lost faith in Nintendo. The Wii U was their first HD console with power on par with the PS3 and 360, had a much bigger focus on online functionality, and had a screen on the controller. The only problem was the next generation consoles from Sony and Microsoft were on the way, their online structure was worse than the 360's, and the new controller just confused people into thinking it was an accessory for the Wii, not to mention the terrible marketing. The sad thing is the Wii U actually had a ton of great games. Miiverse was pretty cool too, being a sort of social network where you could write messages and send pictures for other users to see. With better marketing, better hardware, and a different name, the Wii U might have stood a chance. The best things to come out of the Wii U were the lessons learned by Nintendo that led them to creating the Switch. It hurts me to put the GameCube so low on the list. It was the last time Nintendo would try to compete in terms of power. They failed for one reason: the discs. The PS2 might have been a weaker console, but it was also a DVD player, leaving the GameCube as the additional console you got if you didn't care about the Xbox. The controller is held in high regard, but it's honestly only good for Smash. The minuscule D-pad is bad enough, but how hard would it have been to put a left shoulder button there? Now, I'm not saying the GameCube is bad, it gave us Melee within its first 3 months, and it also had one of the best Zelda games and the best Mario Kart. Yeah, I said it, fight me. The third-party support wasn't bad either, and this is the time when Nintendo started to step out of their comfort zone. Despite all of that, and the fact that it's probably the most relevant console from that generation because of the continued support for Melee, it was essentially another console for Nintendo fans. The 3DS launch was a disaster. At $250 with no game included and a small handful of games available, there was really no reason to buy it. It seemed like Nintendo were banking on a gimmick no one asked for to sell the system, but the 3D effect was a strain on the eyes and rarely worked as intended. The 3DS was really starting to look like another Virtual Boy for about 6 months until Nintendo cut the price to $170 and offered everyone who bought one at full price a handful of digital games, half of which still weren't available on the console otherwise. Ocarina of Time 3D helped boost sales, but it wasn't until later in the year with releases like Super Mario 3D Land and Mario Kart 7 that sales really started to pick up. Instead of leaving the console out to dry like they later would with the Wii U, third parties continued to support the 3DS and it quickly gained a library of incredible games rivaling its predecessor. The upgraded version, the new 3DS, helped those games run even better and fixed the flaws in the 3D mechanic. The 2DS was a cheaper version for kids and people who didn't really care about the 3D feature, and the 3DS family continued selling like crazy even after the release of the Switch. Its biggest competition, in spite of having much better hardware, never even came close to the sales numbers the 3DS had. Sony kind of saw to that themselves by not supporting their own machine. Even though it's a great underdog story, I couldn't put the 3DS higher on the list due to its awful launch. After 12 years of dominating the portable gaming market, the Game Boy finally got a true successor. The 32-bit widescreen Game Boy Advance was basically an upgraded portable Super Nintendo, and much like the SNES, it was an RPG fan's dream. Strategy games really hit their stride here as well. Having Advance Wars and Golden Sun within a few months of launch made the GBA a must-have for hardcore gamers, while the Super Mario Advance series kept casuals happy. Having games of this quality and length on the go was a big step when looking at Nintendo's previous handheld, the Game Boy Color. Most of Nintendo's key franchises saw successful entries on the GBA. Fire Emblem and the aforementioned Famicom Wars both made their Western debut here, Metroid saw its first sequel since 1994's Super Metroid, and Generation 3 changed the way Pokemon was played. There were also a ton of remakes like Kirby Nightmare in Dreamland, the Donkey Kong Country trilogy, and Sonic the Hedgehog. Yeah, they weren't all good. The console's revision, the Game Boy Advance SP, solved all the problems of the original Game Boy and the GBA by having a front and later backlit screen and a rechargeable battery pack. Did I mention these could also play all Game Boy and Game Boy Color games as well? Nintendo also released the Game Boy Micro, which was a tiny version of the GBA with no backward compatibility, though I'm not really sure why. It It was hard to decide whether the Wii should be near the top or bottom of this list. On one hand, it was way underpowered, was flooded with shovelware, and a lot of games threw in motion controls just because. On the other hand, it sold like it was the only video game console in existence, had a handful of great games, a massive library of classic titles from multiple consoles, got everyone's grandparents to play, and made Sony and Microsoft look like fools when they tried to copy the Wii's motion controls. All the extra features seem kind of pointless now, but being able to download other people's Miis, go online, watch videos, vote on things, and even stream Netflix was pretty entertaining back in the day. The massive success of the Wii put Nintendo in a position where they could only go downhill, and boy did they ever. At least it looks like they're back on the right track. The Super Nintendo was a fantastic console and my personal favorite of all time. However, it was basically the next step from the NES. But, I mean, that's exactly what we needed in 1991. Sega's 16-bit console had already been on the market for 2 years, but was barely catching up to the 8-bit NES. The Super Nintendo came out swinging with a pretty remarkable handful of launch games. Super Mario World proved how expansive games on this new console could be when compared to the previous entries in the series. SimCity was a better port of the PC version, and Pilot Wings and F-Zero demonstrated the Mode 7 capabilities. Every franchise that started on the NES got even better on the Super Nintendo. Zelda, Kirby, Donkey Kong, Fire Emblem in Japan, and especially Metroid had some of their best games here. Third parties were killing it as well. Squaresoft with Final Fantasy VI and Chrono Trigger, Konami with Castlevania 4, Turtles in Time, and Capcom with pretty much anything they made back then. Around this time, fighting games were getting super popular and the Super Nintendo controller was perfect for them. 4 face buttons, 2 shoulder buttons, and a comfortable and accurate D-pad meant it was the best place to play Street Fighter and Mortal Kombat, even without the blood. So this might be the most disputable entry on the list. Its biggest competitor was the Sony PlayStation, which was already on the market for a year in the US, used CD-ROMs for larger capacity, and had some of the biggest third-party developers on their side. However, booting up Super Mario 64 for the first time was like nothing we'd ever seen before. It's not quite open world, but each stage encourages exploration with multiple objectives, and the best part is, moving in this game feels amazing. Compared to most 3D games of the time, Mario 64 really holds up in terms of visuals and controls, probably because the controller was built around the movement in that game. The 4 controller ports in games like Mario Kart, Mario Party, Smash Bros, and GoldenEye made the 64 the best console to play with friends. The 2 Zelda games and Rare's 3D platformers made it a great single-player console as well. The only problem with the 64 was a lack of great third-party games. Nintendo's decision to use expensive cartridges instead of CDs and some bad blood between them and developers meant they would miss out on benchmark titles like Symphony of the Night, Final Fantasy VII, and Metal Gear Solid. Quite the opposite of the Super Nintendo, there was a huge absence of fighting games and RPGs on the 64. The reason I placed it so highly on the list is because it gave us experiences that weren't really available anywhere else. The DS wasn't Nintendo's first handheld with massive appeal, I'll get to that in a minute, but it certainly got the casual market ready for the Wii. Before the DS, video games were still considered to be for kids and nerds, but the touchscreen, which wasn't as widely used in 2004 as it is today, made it so anyone with fingers could easily play. The launch lineup honestly wasn't that impressive, but the touchscreen and clamshell design was interesting enough that the DS sold out immediately. Mario 64 DS proved how much more powerful the DS was compared to the GBA. Games like Brain Age and especially Nintendogs caught the interest of people who might not have been big on video games previously, and New Super Mario Bros. Brought back those who grew up with the NES. The DS really had something for everyone. The online functionality, as primitive as it was, made it so you could easily connect with others to visit their Animal Crossing town, race in Mario Kart, or trade and battle Pokemon. The DSi added more utility with a camera and music player in a time when smartphones were just starting to get really popular. It also had an online store for exclusive digital games and apps. The DSi was honestly more of a halfway point between the DS and 3DS, and I never really had a reason to upgrade. With a lifespan of 14 years, the Game Boy was a massive success for Nintendo. Being bundled with Tetris at launch was a very early indicator of how important the casual market really is. Like the DS and the Wii, everyone had a Game Boy. When parents weren't playing Tetris, the kids had Super Mario Land and Kirby's Dream Land. The Game Boy had a growing library of games that were perfect for short play sessions in the car, on the bus, or my personal favorite place to play the Game Boy, the toilet. Link's Awakening and Return of Samus proved longer adventures could work on the handheld as well, or as long as you could stand to look at that pea green screen. As the Game Boy continued to sell unopposed, Nintendo's biggest rival at the time, Sega, released their handheld console, the Game Gear. It had a bigger colored screen and games that looked way more similar to home console games than the Game Boy did. The only problem was, it took a lot of juice to power that screen, and the Game Gear would tear through 6 AA batteries in about 3 hours. That is horrible compared to the Game Boy's 10 to 15 hours for 4 AA's. And by the time the Game Gear would have gained any traction in the market, Nintendo no longer made games that look like this, but ones that look like this. In addition to the bigger and better looking games, Nintendo's marketing got a bit more aggressive and they soon released a new version of the Game Boy. The Game Boy Pocket made the screen more bearable and cut down on the cost of batteries, requiring only 2 AAAs. Shortly after that, something incredible happened. A worldwide phenomenon and one of the biggest events in the history of gaming, the release of Pokemon. Game Boy owners finally had a reason to use the link cable, and if there was anyone who didn't already have a Game Boy, they did now. Pokemon was like something we've never seen before, a huge open world, well, not really, but it felt that way, full of different creatures that you could capture, train, and battle your friends with. It was kind of like Tamagotchi if they actually did something besides poop and die. Pokemon was literally everywhere, and Nintendo released another upgrade to the Game Boy so we could see them in color. The first 2 Pokemon generations pretty much carried the Game Boy for the next few years until the release of the GBA. The NES is where it all started. Nintendo may have been known in Japan for their toys and Game & Watch, but they were almost entirely unheard of in the US until the release of the NES. In 1985, the US was in the midst of the video game crash caused by Atari and their incredibly low standards. Because of that, retailers were reluctant to stock any games or consoles. Nintendo had the incredible idea to bundle their console with a robot and call it a toy just to get it onto shelves. But once consumers popped in Super Mario Bros., minds were blown. It might sound crazy today, but the first Super Mario game was an incredible leap in quality from home console games of that time. It was fast, colorful, and had characters you could actually get attached to instead of whatever this is supposed to be. The Nintendo seal of quality and super strict licensing practices ensured, or tried to ensure, that not just anyone could poop out a game and sell it for the NES. Almost all of gaming's classic franchises and a decent chunk of Smash Ultimate's roster started here. The biggest reason this is number 1 is not because it was first, but because if it wasn't for the NES, video games would probably not be what they are today. I hope you enjoyed this video. Leave a comment if you disagree with my placement here and let me know what kind of list you want to see next. Follow me on Facebook, Mixer, Instagram, and Twitter for streams and exclusive content. Thanks for watching. I hope you look forward to my videos throughout the year, and I'll see you next time.